Hi everyone. Today I thought I would respond to a video by Knitting Cult Lady. Armageddon is not a military strategy, written by my friend and podcast co-host Scott Lloyd. And basically I woke up and was listening to this while my brain was turning on. And given that I've spent a good deal of time writing about different religious topics from an atheist perspective, I thought my own point of view might yield some interesting addendums to what this person is saying. I don't disagree with anything that they're saying, really, but I am coming at it from a different point of view, a different research juncture, and from there I can give my own opinion as a researcher, as an activist, as a trans person, as a medievalist. And when I say medievalist, I mean like someone who studies the Gothic, specifically the Neo-Gothic period, but it's steeped in understandings of the Gothic more broadly, meaning the Renaissance or the Middle Ages and earlier periods out of antiquity. So keeping all of that in mind, I just wanted to respond to some different things that this person says in their video. This is an unscripted video. It's just me thinking about things in a very shower thoughts kind of way, where I'm literally just speaking off the cuff. So keeping all of that in mind, they talk about Armageddon, and they talk about revelations, and they talk about a cult mentality through America. And that is something that shapes how the military is wielded by the state through its population in a cult-like way. Specifically, I would argue, the Crusades. It is a seizing of the populace and workers, specifically soldiers, wherein there is no separation of church and state. And you could argue that in America, that separation has largely been absent to some degree or another throughout history, and that through a radicalization of the political machinery through fascism, where imperialism comes home to empire, this has become increasingly evident through Christofascism, Christo-nationalism. There are different names for it, but basically palingenetic ultranationalism is kind of the fancy label for fascism that covers all the basic bases. And then if you want to look at the modules of fascism, you might examine Umberto Eco and his 14 points from Fascism. But there is a merging of Christendom and nationalism, church and the state. And then you combine that further with Mussolini, corporation and the state. The point being is that the state is sort of the central juncture, and you're combining different things with it, be it Christianity, corporation, church, corporation, the state more broadly. And I generally define the state as the status quo, and it's through the nation-state model that is, again, being married to different things to wield power for the bourgeoisie, first and foremost, the ruling class. Nowadays, people would call it the Epstein class, but ultimately what they're talking about is the bourgeoisie. And there are different ways that you can conduct a seizing of power through these mechanisms, because you're not just working a lever when dealing with people. People aren't machines. Instead, you're working through what Marx would call the superstructure. You have the base, you have factories, you have the means of production, but then you also have media that, through the means of production, is something you direct at people's eyeballs. Mainstream media, first and foremost. Nowadays, it would be tech centers. Before that, it would have been television networks. It would have been the printing press. And before that, the church, right? Before you had the schism and the Reformation and the iconoclasm, all of those events, after the invention of the printing press, the administration of information from itself to the people would have been delivered through the church. And we are seeing a decay back in that direction as the state is decaying. And when the state decays, it enters crisis by design. It bears repeating that capital and the state rape by design. They abuse power by design is another way that you could phrase that. And again, because people aren't machines, instead what people in power are doing, the bourgeoisie are doing, is they are using whatever levers they can pull to manipulate people through the superstructure and the base. Those go hand in hand, and they go hand in hand with labor as something to manipulate through various means. Keeping all of that in mind, this person, Knitting Cult Lady, talks about Armageddon not being a military strategy. The point being is that the Crusades are a military strategy insofar as the military, through the Crusades, historically was, it has been argued, a means of dealing with so many knights who had a certain amount of control, a certain amount of power, and the Pope, to get rid of all these competitors under his influence, sent them off to the Middle East to die. And it could be argued that there is some promise of elevation. If you go to the Holy Land and you kill in my name, you could potentially have a piece of said land for yourself to carve out a new kingdom. Knights were the lowest order of nobility in the Middle Ages, and they were someone who had to pay taxes, and they were someone who enacted the will of the state. Again, the state being just where power is centered, and in the medieval period, this would have been city-states going into what eventually evolved into nation-states towards the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. This would have been centered around the church and kingdoms, feudalism, and which weren't separate. You know, the separation of church and state hadn't happened yet, and arguably has never really fully happened, even in, say, the Soviet Union, where it became supposedly a nation of atheists overnight. People still practiced religion, and it was something that, as far as I understand, they could practice, they just couldn't proselytize. So as far as that goes, you still had these levers of power that were controlling the population through two basic things: sex and force. We're focusing here on force because force is generally something that you promote to get sex, which a state is built around. So if you go off to the Holy Land, you kill a bunch of infidels, and then you can have a piece of that new kingdom for yourself and potentially a bride, that kind of thing. And so sex is generally something that is policed, corralled, controlled, cattled through force. And there are different arguments that those holding the levers of the state can argue. Those can be overtly religious, or they can be overtly atheist. It doesn't matter. The flowing of power through the state and the various arguments that it can make have the same end result, which is the controlling of people. One term for that is totalitarianism, a concern with the total control of one's society. Not that they had total control, mind you, but that's what they were invested in, to try and control as many people within society on all registers as they possibly could. And the reason that I mention the Soviets is they're an interesting example of pushing people to radical extremes. Despite them being a nation of atheists, they were enacted through Soviet dogma to do things comparable to the Crusades. Think of Stalingrad, for instance, where the bloodiest battle in human history, arguably, and certainly in modern war, where all of these people went to die in God's name. You're like, well, wait a second, aren't they a nation of atheists? Yes, they are, but they went to go and die for the head of their cult of personality, Stalin. Go and defend this city and die for it in Stalin's name. It was largely the population of Stalingrad, but there were, various members of the Red Army who didn't live in that city who also went there to defend it from the Germans. So it's the same basic idea where you have these levers of power and you direct people there in ways comparable to what people would conceptualize Armageddon as in a modern sense. Armageddon is the end times. Armageddon is the apocalypse, is Revelations. But as Knitting Cult Lady points out, Revelations was a biblical text written under Roman rule originally to provide perspective to people who were being dominated by empire before empire had converted to Christianity. In those days, the Christians weren't the status quo. They were scapegoated by empire alongside the Jews. The Romans were originally pagan, and they didn't convert to Christianity until near the end of the fall of empire into later periods, into the Middle Ages, and when they became known as the Byzantines. So, keeping all of that in mind, this idea of Armageddon has a dualistic notion to it, where it doesn't just exist as something that is used by the state, atheist or otherwise, to achieve apocalyptic ends, which is go and die for the state to achieve the desired result, which is a moving of money and resources through nature. That is Patel and Moore's description of capital, and it is something that applies to countries that say socialist on the tin, and that goes for the Nazis, the National Socialists, and it goes for the Bolsheviks, who also called themselves socialists or communists, and both of them were ruled by dictators in practice, I would argue, and the way that they arranged power was different, of course, but at the end of the day, they utilized various forms of rhetoric to achieve their ends. So even if something isn't overtly religious, it can be used in ways that push power towards the state. I call this state vampirism, or the feeding on a population and various aspects of workers, the land, animals, nature, what have you, to move power up towards the state. So, by extension, the military and its movement and use through the ruling class, strategy for them is capital, ultimately, whether for profit and or productivity, because the more socialist-leaning aspects of state order would favor productivity over profit. Either way, you still have money and resources and manpower through the military moving through nature. So, that for them is the strategy. That for them is the end goal. And other people who think, oh, well, isn't the military supposed to be used for the defense of a nation's boundaries? And I'm like, well, you can do two things at once, while also keeping in mind that states die by design. Empires die by design. They don't live forever. And the death of an empire coincides with profit and productivity. You get as much profit and productivity as you can, and that effectively becomes seed money for the next generation of rulers, the next kingdom, the one in the afterlife that people of various religions are talking about. Or in the case of Hitler, they would have framed it as the kingdom that would last 1,000 years, the Third Reich. In this case, now we're at the Fourth Reich, and they would have framed theirs as a death cult, right? And they would have been death before dishonor, die for the nation. But the reality is that even after the Third Reich went down in flames, Germany rose up from the ashes to continue, initially divided as East and West, then unifying once more. But the state ultimately resurrected from the ashes of the Third Reich. So again, Armageddon is just the outcome of the state dying and being reborn in ways where the ruling class, through the moving of all of these resources through various arguments, can hold on to power. So it's a cycle for them. So military strategy is viewed differently through people who are accustomed to holding on to power indefinitely while sending the state into cycles of death and rebirth. Very similar to Armageddon, to the apocalypse, where there's an end of the world. Cults, like the Nazis in the Third Reich, for instance, would have believed that you are pushing towards a final battle, final victory, Armageddon, essentially. And they see the reward as something unto itself, or something that you will be rewarded as being absorbed into the nation, as becoming one with, for all intents and purposes, their sense of divinity, which is, again, the cult of death. So they wouldn't really see past that. But the point being is that they're manipulating people in ways where they defend those at the center, those at the top, from enemies outside of the national body. And the two things are going hand in hand. The end result, which is death, because that's what profit is. It's exploitation. It's rape of workers, where through these various modes of rhetoric, they are being pushed to faraway lands to die on a battlefield, first and foremost. And the end result is those in power are effectively feeding on them vampirically. That's the strategy. And it's multitasking because you're also conducting defense of the center of the state, the heads of state, the bourgeoisie, at the same time. The point being is the dualistic nature here, taking all of what we said in mind, is something that can be utilized in ways that are beneficial to workers. Insofar as, I would say, just as Knitting Cult Lady points out, that Revelations was originally written shortly after the death of Christ to speak about the persecution of Christians under the pagan Romans, we can take the same idea and apply it to an apocalypse happening in present times, but not in a way that is conducive to military action, but rather critiquing the state and its military arm as tied to the church, and the church's use of various arguments as levers to leverage against a population to get them to go and die for church, die for country, die for the ruling class, as usual. And I'm an atheist. I'm a Satanist. I worship the Gorgon. And my academic and activist arguments as a trans woman, as a sex worker, center around those ideas to reverse the objection process, which is fundamental to vampirism, as something to unto itself further or reverse, using the same levers of power. Power isn't something that's controlled by the state exclusively, but they do have control of the base. They do have control of factories, of computers, under, for all intents and purposes, techno-feudalism is something that the state is decaying towards. And under Christofascism, Christian nationalism. And for us, for me specifically, I would argue that the state is something to challenge through the language of Armageddon, which they're using, but also I'm using in duality to punch up. You have the zombie apocalypse, which again has echoes or mirrors revelations and the happening of many apocalyptic things, the judgment day, the dead rising from the grave, isn't, strictly speaking, viewed in a negative light. And this isn't just by so-called true believers who are used by the state as useful idiots and cannon fodder, but also police agents to police people at home to crack down and prepare the population at home for war abroad. Because again, war is a form of capital. So military strategy, as far as I see it, through Marxist thought, is a means of the bourgeoisie moving money through nature. So when Knitting Cult Lady says Armageddon is not a military strategy, they're ignoring the capitalist function of the military within state models. And I think they're seeing it more, okay, if we do this, we won't survive. And I'm like, well, I got news for you, honey. The state doesn't care about its soldiers surviving. It cares about sending them off to fight. And in order for them to do that, they have to come up with some kind of argument, whether it's religious or not. In the case of Stalin, he did it through a cult of personality that was atheist, despite the fact that they still had religious soldiers fighting for them in ways comparable to a Crusades. Oftentimes, the enemy is someone who's invading our land, in their case. So they had a siege mentality, by and large, through the Red Army, whereas Hitler and company through Lebensraum were inspired by Manifest Destiny. Go forth and take your land. There's not enough room where we are. You have to go somewhere else. So the Crusades, as it existed as a historical moment in time in the Middle Ages, was something that went on to inform Manifest Destiny under the Americans, which went on to inform the Nazis. And diametrically under that arrangement, Stalin and company had to make similar imperialist arguments, albeit inverted ones, atheist ones, going up against the Nazis, who unto themselves believed themselves to be the knights of a new medieval order. They were pagan ultimately, but you can incorporate religion into any state, regardless if it's the National Socialists, if it's the USSR, or the United States, for that matter, which has always been a Christian nation, a fascist nation since its beginning. There has never been an atheist president, and most American presidents have been Protestant. Maybe two presidents, JFK and Biden, have been Catholic, but by and large, most of them have been Protestant Christian, which means that any military strategy to conduct capital through genocide, at home or abroad, has used some kind of religious argument, which critics thereof, myself personally, as a Gothicist, as a medievalist, as an activist, as a trans woman, a sex worker, what have you, would challenge through the same arguments, but from a different utilizing thereof, namely the zombie apocalypse. On the zombie apocalypse, the dead rising from the grave, George Romero onwards, built on other authors, of course, all the way back to Matthew Lewis and the arguing of the dead rising from the grave, which goes back even further, of course, to Revelations, but and Christ being like the OG zombie of Western thought, and even before that, let's be honest, but But for all intents and purposes, Christ is a good starting point, and Christianity has been critiqued throughout history as leaning into vampirism and zombies, the eating of Christ's flesh, the drinking of Christ's blood, Christ rising from the grave, tied to some kind of divinity that has the power to do that kind of thing, to cheat death, to resurrect someone. And the rising of the dead, through Romero's point of view, the Night of the Living Dead, the Night of Anubis, the original script, that name for Night of the Living Dead, Night of Anubis, was based off Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which told a story of vampires rising from the grave in a zombie-like way. So the modern concept of zombie tied to capital as being basically a fear of social unrest was tied to McCarthyism, was tied to the civil rights movement, and various clashes with workers punching up against the state, similar to Revelations and the Christians under the Romans. You need some kind of text to give you a way of, for all intents and purposes, voicing that to other workers. And the state will use that to move money and military through nature to achieve profit, productivity, to basically push the state through its cycles of death and rebirth over and over. But workers will use that in duality to counteract state vampirism through the abjection process, through the confronting of zombies and the living dead. The whole point of zombies for us during a revelation, which I haven't said until now, but which means to uncover something. An apocalypse means to uncover something, to get at something that is hidden. And again, from Revelations onwards, they are uncovering the abuse of state power in language when in Rome, quite literally. And the Christians of the time used the language that they had access to speak to the power abuses that were being committed against them in the same language that the abusers use. You're subverting it when in Rome under the influence of state power. And a military woman, like Knitting Cult Lady, a career girl, I can understand where they're using this to warn against the dangers of the state, and basically speaking to people within the military and saying, look, this isn't a valid military strategy. It's a Pyrrhic victory. At best, it is going to lead to our destruction, in ways where they're warning against like this type of thing that does not serve the interests of workers, specifically soldiers, but it serves those who use soldiers as pawns on a chessboard to achieve profit, to achieve productivity, as useful to the life and death of the state. Because ultimately the bourgeoisie don't care if workers die. Point of fact, they're actually quite invested in having workers die, the same way that you might have a bomb explode or a bullet being fired. In their eyes, that's all a soldier is. They're just a weapon to direct somewhere to move money through nature. That's it. They're a means to an end. A means of exploitation, of rape, the tip of the spear, if you will. So, wrapping up here, there are different ways that you can critique Christofascism, Christian nationalism, as a cult. I would do it specifically as an anti-capitalist, as an anti-racist, as an eco-socialist, as someone who, through a desire to combat state vampirism and be better stewards of nature, through a holistic intersectional solution that is striving for universal liberation, I ultimately have to be critical of the military as an arm of the state, first and foremost. Now, there is a militant function to resistance that is violent and nonviolent alike. The shield and the sword is utilized by civil rights activists like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You also have various marriages of different things. Military language, the Gothic, the knight in shining armor. As a medievalist, I totally understand using that rhetoric and the rhetoric of apocalypse, of Armageddon, in ways where, look, at the very least, I have to voice it to say, look, Judgment Day is something we probably want to avoid, huh? But also, we're zombies in the eyes of the state. Speaking as a trans woman, for instance, you become what's known as homo sacer. You become known as bare life, something that is reduced purely to biology, pure biology, without any rights, something that is killed without any pomp and circumstance, without any sort of air of sacred quality. Sort of, instead of Christ on the cross, the dead walk the earth in ways where they're killed without ceremony, and they're killed outside of any sort of open military conquest or operation at a national body, but rather it's just raw earth that has risen like a golem or something comparable and has to be manipulated like clay in a very neutral kind of way through Agamben's state of emergency, state of exception, perpetual state of exception. You have the abusing of people who are treated like zombies through military violence that is tied to the state. So all of this stuff is sort of swimming in the same cauldron and in the same soup of said cauldron in ways where, while the state is holding the spoon, stirring, and you have workers punching up who are trying to wrestle control away from them while having to deal with an apocalypse where they are the zombies, but also those who serve the state and further the objection process. Instead of hugging the zombie, they become zombies themselves, specifically Death Knights, who are givers of state force to control the local population to prepare them for war abroad, because they're pushing for these wars in different countries for different reasons, distractions, partly profit, and various other things. Trump is trying to avoid accountability for the Epstein files and various other crimes that he's committed, as are other members of the ruling class. As always, the law is something that serves them but doesn't apply to them, and vice versa. The law is something that doesn't serve workers but applies to them. And then there's military law and all of that. So there are different kinds of laws. Laws of the church, laws of the state, laws of the military, laws of a civil sort, and through civil struggle, military struggle, the struggle of workers versus the state, states' rights versus workers' rights. It's the state's right to send workers off to die through stupid arguments. That Knitting Cult Lady is absolutely right in saying this is a bad argument. It's not a winning military strategy, but they also need to recognize that the military, through capital, is something that utilizes various arguments all the time. Soldiers that went off to die in World War II, D-Day, go forth and fight for country and for God. And various military generals, I forget, was it Eisenhower who made the speech to the soldiers of D-Day landing at Normandy? I think it was Eisenhower who basically had to go and tell these men who are going off to die, go and die for God. Like, God was something that was evoked in a very Christian nationalist kind of way. Defense of the nation was made while invoking God's name, hiding the men behind the curtain. God is just an illusion. God isn't real, but the bourgeoisie are, and they're pulling that lever. And Eisenhower was someone who was a general, a commander of the American forces, eventually became commander-in-chief as the president of the United States, and then when he left office warned of the military-industrial complex. Well, I got news for you. The military-industrial complex has a Christian character to it, and any winning military strategy, foreign policy, pursues profit through the division of workers and the owners, and efficient profit, which is what Armageddon is, and infinite military conquest, which is a means to conduct Armageddon. There must always be another Armageddon because profit demands it. You have to cede territory and then reclaim it through some kind of crusade. And unfortunately, that's just how militaries have worked since the Roman period. Even with the Romans, when they were pagan, similar to the Soviets, thousands of years later, the Romans were pagans that made similar arguments where you had to go and control other territories. They did it as a city-state, first and foremost, Rome being a city-state that didn't have the means to basically conduct imperialism on a global level yet. They certainly tried, but there were technological limitations to that made it more difficult. Nowadays, that's not the case. The technology is in place specifically through techno-feudalism. So yeah, these are just my thoughts and feelings. I wanted to make a video about this, again, totally unscripted, but responding to Knitting Cult Lady, specifically when they said Revelations was a voice for Christians under the oppression of the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago now, where they were experiencing this kind of oppression. And I'm like, hey, so are we. So is Knitting Cult Lady as a soldier, a kind of worker, and also me as a worker, a trans woman facing genocide under Christofascism through the United States, where you have smaller cults, but then you have larger cults, cults of personality, cults of the state. The church is basically a cult. It's a high control group that tries to control people at the highest possible register. And not just within nation states, but through a global order, through Pax Americana. And the decay of Pax Americana is just another part of the same cycle of capital, of profit, of the church and state. So, yeah, hopefully you found this little diatribe by me interesting. I do like Knitting Cult Lady. You know, they're a soldier who served in the military. They don't really lean into Marxist dialogues quite as much, and dialectical materialism. They kind of lack a Marxist critique and Marxist language, but they do yield an interesting perspective, and they do critique fascism, and they do use various terms to call fascism what it is, a spade, and they tie it specifically to Christo-nationalism, Christo-fascism, that kind of thing. So I do like that. I do find what they say useful, even if there are certain times where I'm like, okay, I do wish that you might recognize, like, look, this isn't just cult leaders, it's the bourgeoisie. But they never really say that. So that's a knowledge gap in their particular critique of capital, of the state. But they are coming at it from their own perspective, and they are a specialist who focuses primarily on cults. I haven't read their book, but I've certainly heard them talk about it. I've heard other people involved in the project or similar projects talk about it, the same way that Chelsea Manning, working within the military, would critique the military, or Eisenhower might critique the military, having served and worked in the military. There are plenty of useful perspectives. Bob Ross, Edward Snowden, and various other people who worked in the State Department. William Blum, Killing Hope, critiquing the CIA. He worked within state bodies originally, left them, and then wrote that book, which is a foundational way to understand how the CIA operates and intervenes around the world, which unto itself is tied to Armageddon. So people like Knitting Cult Lady are definitely offer plenty of useful things. Even people like Trump are ultimately useful because they offer up things that we should not do. So everyone's useful in some shape or form. All of that being said, I'm going to cut things off here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Go and subscribe to Knitting Cult Lady. They never really say anything that I feel like is problematic. Just I feel like they could probably be a little bit more Marxist. But go and subscribe to them. If you like my content, you can like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Anything helps. Ways to support me. Links are in the description through my link tree, Ko-fi, Patreon, etc. I would appreciate it. It goes towards supporting me and the work that I do and helping the people that I help, which tend to be gender non-conforming people, sex workers, what have you. And yeah, until next time, stay safe out there and good luck, comrades.